Perspective with TT, Monday to Thursday, 8 p.m. to midnight.
Speaking of money matters, so with the tax brackets unchanged for the 2025, salary increases above 5% may leave South Africans financially worse off due to what is known as the bracket creep. Inflation is projected to be between 3.6 and 4.3%, meaning even moderate raises push earners into higher tax brackets, increasing deductions and reducing take-home pay. Experts warn that a 5% raise is needed just to maintain a current spending power. Earlier on, I spoke to tax and remuneration specialist at Tanya Tosen, and I began by first asking her to explain what the impact of the announcement in as far as tax brackets or remaining unchanged when the Minister of Finance delivered the budget speech earlier, what impact that had, and then this is how she went on to explain.
TT, it was actually very interesting. The initial budget that was proposed to be released in February, they mentioned that South Africans would get some inflationary relief on the tax brackets. And then when we had the final budget speech announced in March, on the 12th of March, the Minister of Finance confirmed that the tax brackets will remain as is. And the biggest concern is that this is the second year in a row that the tax bracket has not been adjusted for inflation. So that is the first problem that every South African should be made aware of. And then when you talk about bracket creep, in essence, what that means is we work on an annual tax table and we have a progressive tax system. So, depending where your income falls, a certain portion of it is taxed at various marginal tax rates. Now, what would happen in simple terms is if someone's income is close and bordering the next marginal tax bracket. So let's say I am in the 31% bracket and I get an inflationary adjustment, but it could technically push me into the 36% bracket. And what that means in essence is part of my increase might be taxed at 31% and part of it at 36%, which means my increase is being eroded by myself progressing into higher tax brackets because the tax brackets weren't adjusted for inflation.
What are then the direct consequences of it? What are the implications of it? I mean, on the face of it, it seems like, what it means is that, I get a 5% increase that I'm given by my generous boss, but because there's no adjustment of the tax brackets, it pushes me into a higher tax bracket, which could possibly mean that part of or most of that increase that I've been granted goes to tax.
Absolutely. So the consequences, number one, is that SARS is going to get an additional 19.5 billion rand in the next tax year because these brackets haven't been adjusted. And so it's a great revenue stream because most people will start to jump into the higher brackets. And then the second problem that individuals should be made aware of and organizations is, TT, as you mentioned, if you're getting a 5% increase, you might not be keeping up with inflation because if you do the math, to keep up with that inflationary adjustment that you should have received, and inflation, they mentioned in the budget speech, is 4.3%. In essence, just to bring you up to that inflationary adjustment of the tax tables, organizations would have to look at giving people over 5% or 5.5% just to meet inflationary adjustments. So that doesn't acknowledge your star performers either. It just helps you keep up with inflation.
Wow, that sounds like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, I can't do without the increase. I need the increase. Not that I can't do without it, but I do need the increase to keep up with the inflation. But on the other hand, if I do get this increase, I'm not going to enjoy the full benefits thereof. So where does that leave me then as a taxpayer who's potentially the recipient of an increase?
So that's a very good question. I would encourage employees to take a direct invested interest in the earnings and their increase amounts. They would have to also approach the employer where, they feel it's an unfair increase. And your reward committees and your HR staff in an organization would have to carefully consider how are they going to address this to attract and retain their talent in organizations. So what is interesting as well, where organizations can't give higher increases, I get a lot of organizations approaching me, how do we structure packages more effectively? And organizations should also consider, offering a cost-to-company structure with flexible benefits. So this becomes a little bit more technical, but then, you could potentially allow employees to structure their packages to either have more cash, less benefits, or vice versa within certain criteria.
So with the way that our tax system is structured and the way the brackets works, who would be most affected by such bracket creep?
Every single South African working in South Africa, and not just South Africans. Obviously, there are expats who also work in South Africa, but anyone that has, remuneration and taxable income, which is subject to the normal personal income tax rates, will be affected by this.
Now, what is the normal practice when it comes to this? I mean, is it one of the things that, we should come to expect, that there may not be an adjustment of the tax brackets on an annual basis? Is it purely at the discretion of the finance minister?
Absolutely. It is at the discretion. So for many years, TT, we've always had inflationary adjustment relief. So one would notice that your net pay would actually go up slightly in March every month, and that would be because those tax brackets have been adjusted so that everybody gets a little bit more in their net pay thanks to SARS and the government. But because of the economic standing and the government needing more money to service debt and various other concerns, they have made that decision not to adjust the brackets. And I was quite excited initially that they were considering giving us inflationary relief, and when they proposed that they not, I thought this is a big problem that should be seriously addressed by all employees and organizations.
I think you did touch on this a short while ago, but is there a way of mitigating against this?
Unfortunately not. We're all governed by those tax tables, so the only other way is to look at how you structure your packages, look at, as an organization, are you wasting money on benefits that employees might not value? And also remember, we're going to be hard hit again when the potential VAT increase comes into effect, which means every employee's disposable income is being eroded even further with that on the cards in the next couple of months.
My guest is Tanya Tosen, a tax and remuneration specialist. We're talking about the hidden cost of salary increases in South Africa. As you say, we would all be impacted one way or the other. I'm just wondering, in terms of what you just alluded to there, in terms of the benefits that some companies give to employees that they may not value or derive much benefit from. How does the taxman actually view those benefits? For example, such things as car and housing allowances. Does the taxman view them as just part of my package, and therefore, if my my housing benefits are, from my employer, 5,000 Rand on a monthly basis, does the taxman view that as an additional 5,000 Rand in my income?
Yes, absolutely. So all those allowances are lumped together, and if they're recurring amounts, they get annualized. So, when I've consulted with some of the mines in South Africa where you're getting all these shift allowances and overtime allowances and the housing allowances, unfortunately, these middle or lower income employees never understand why they end up paying so much more tax, because they just think that their basic salary is taxed, but all these other allowances actually make them jump various tax brackets, as mentioned. So, it's so important, in my view, that either from an employee perspective or employer perspective, that there's also a level of education that is provided to help empower employees.
Is it a case that one is worse off, or that one just doesn't? You are basically where you started, because of inflation.
So it all depends on what the proposed salary increases organisations are considering on giving. TT, if they decide on giving you a 7-8% increase, that's way above inflation. I think any employee would be smiling. But, I've heard from different industries, some organisations are only considering a 3.7% increase. That's way below the inflation rate of 4.3%. And that 3.7 then gets further eroded because they're not getting the relief from the tax brackets. So in essence, they're actually working backwards if you have to do the maths, because all the electricity is going up. We look at, just basic benefits like medical aid, which goes up in double-digit increments every year. So,
sorry, please go finish your thought. Yeah.
No, carry on.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you to just explain, if you will, please help me understand what the benefits of an employer or an employee asking the employer to give them more take home rather than these non-cash benefits. Does it not amount to the same thing then if the non-cash benefits are seen as just for part of your package?
So that's an excellent question, I must tell you. It all depends what industry the organisation is in. It depends on the demographics of the staff, so depending on your different age groups. You find the millennials want lots of cash because they want to go on the overseas holidays, they want that fancy car, whereas someone who's middle-aged or they've got little children, you saw this especially in COVID, they want to make sure that if something happens to them, they've got good life insurance. And depending on the scale of the organisation, those benefits can cost a lot less with that bulk purchasing power. It's like, buying balconies at macro as opposed to getting insured individually. And that's where employees can score. So it all depends on the mix and the value system and the culture of the company. So, unfortunately, there's not one retirement fund in taking advantage of, that 350,000 Rand tax deduction every year. And that applies to your pension, your provident, and your retirement annuities. There are small solutions, but again, if you weigh it up, this is not going to make massive impact and substantial difference. And employees need to be, as I said, they should be educated, as well as organizations, on, what's the best way to structure their package and take advantage legally of tax breaks where you can.
Is it conceivable that we could have a scenario such as this for 2 financial years in a row, that where once again the tax brackets are not adjusted come the next budget speech?
So, TT, if you look at the numbers, the biggest revenue stream for the South African government comes from personal income tax payers. And that is very unfortunate. So they're heavily reliant on us to actually generate that income. But, they've got to reassess that, where companies can't afford to give increases or where they start having retrenchments, that base is shrinking. Even though we have seen over the years, if you look at the numbers, because of bracket creep, certain employees have been pushed into the tax net, where before they fell below the tax threshold, you're getting more and more employees even being caught to even pay minimal tax. Again, it's just to expand that tax base to generate more income.
I note the warning that you give that, this kind of, if government continues to, increase the burden on the taxpayers, it actually has the effect of maybe even encouraging more taxpayers to seek measures that, tax avoidance measures.
So there were actually a few articles released that Kiesbetter actually mentioned that, they're also targeting non-compliant taxpayers. I think there was an article that was released that there's 100,000 taxpayers who earn more than R1 million who are not paying tax. And I think that is a fantastic, approach from SARS, because I don't, it's almost like we're punishing the good people here who are paying their taxes every month and every year. But, collectively, we need everyone to be held accountable to the same, laws and regulations, in my view.
Yeah, that's what one would hope for. Now, just in terms of, I don't know, what would the correct word be? Is again, tax avoidance is not against the law.
No,
it's not tax evasion.
Well, SARS has become a little bit more aggressive. It's now becoming a criminal offence.
Wow.
Where people, yes, there have been certain cases in the media as well mentioning that, if you're trying to deliberately avoid or defraud tax, they are going to take criminal action. And this also becomes a big responsibility, for those heads of HR, payroll, the directors. They can also be held personally accountable where there is a deliberate avoidance, or evasion of taxes. So people should, I always say, really, the juice is not worth the squeeze to try and get away from SARS. They also love people being non-compliant, because every year, even if you're non-compliant, they can impose penalties. That interest, they love interest, because you can never ever get that interest remitted. So they're happy if you're non-compliant. That's another revenue stream.
Yeah. We're going to have to break it in there just now, but we got the most of it in there. That was Tanya Tosen. She's a tax remuneration specialist, talking to us about the hidden costs of salary increases in South Africa.